What I really want to share with you today is my past 20 years of having my head in academic research on service. It's been a passion of mine for quite some time, and it started as an MIT when I was at the CIA. I was so intrigued with just the dynamic, the human interaction that happens between people, between the service staff and the customers. So I was so intrigued by that. I've continued education, and that's what I actually research now. So with that, I was actually recently at a conference at the early part of this year presenting a work in progress I have, my dissertation. And you go to academic conferences to get feedback, to find out, are you on track? Can they help you refine your work any further? And at the opening panel discussion, led by mostly academic leaders in the industry of hospitality colleges, as well as some industry leaders as well. One of the panelists actually implored the audience of about 300 graduate students, professors and PhDs and industry people to, number one, do relevant research that is for practitioners. And that's what I'm going to speak a lot of today. Don't do research just to do research to build your vita, but do relevant work for practitioners. And then he went on to say, to help share with this crowd, to help give them direction, because they're all mostly pretty young, just entering an academic career. He said, by the way, the most under-researched area in hospitality is service, and the most needed area of hospitality research is service. And that stuck with me tremendously. And I have to say, I always peruse the whole offering of every research presentation there, and mine was the only service-related research presentation at the conference, which is disappointing. So I'm happy to be here because I can actually talk about service to a service-centric crowd. So with that, I'm going to give a very broad stroke canvassing of service research of the last 3 decades. A lot of the terminology you've heard today. Some of it you've actually heard the concepts, but maybe not the terminology. So you're going to probably piece it together. But it's really come a long way, and we have a long way to go. So with that, I am a PowerPoint person. Let me move forward. Always got to start off with some shocking data. Hate to say, the cost of poor service, and poor may mean unmet expectations, really, quite frankly. 90% of restaurant patrons do not return to an establishment when dissatisfied with an experience. It's a pretty lofty number. It's NRA data, 12,000 participants surveyed for full-service sit-down restaurant. This doesn't mean fast food. Service is really the top reason for that dissatisfaction. And service doesn't necessarily mean it's translated directly to that customer contact employee. Doesn't necessarily mean that. You know how many times you've had the experience yourself where someone may say, the service was really off, the food took a really long time. Not that we're blaming a kitchen ever, it happens. But they translate that in their mind directly to service or even their service staff member. A couple other pieces I didn't even put on there. About 42% of customers will alert their customer contact employee that they're actually not happy with something going on at that. So we actually have opportunities for service recovery while they're still there and they don't turn into that 90%. 35% of customers will actually alert management, so you still have opportunity. Now this bottom data is a bit dated. 11% will tell 20 others about their poor experience. This is pre-social media. So take that how you will. We don't know the actual damages that can actually occur. So moving into, going back to the 80s, TQM, the Total Quality Management movement, was really kind of the impetus of service getting on the radar in a different way. And I put service profit chain, but prior to that was service breakthroughs. And those authors, Heskett, Sasser, and Schlesinger, pretty much known for that. The service profit chain is still used widely today in research, as well as a reference. And the main piece here in this period of time was service quality. Everyone was looking at how do we measure service? And the old adage of what gets measured gets managed. As you know in service, it's gray. It's slippery. It's hard to manage service. And I heard a lot today, intangible. There's the key reason. It's intangible. So how can we really directly manage or actually rather measure service? Well, service quality was the first period of what we were measuring, predominantly coming out of marketing management and retail. Hospitality wasn't really much in the game, though they used hospitality examples quite frequently. You'll see the hotels, predominantly hotels and retail. The Nordstroms, who doesn't know a good Nordstrom service story? One of the main pieces, it's really kind of a seminal work. You'll see it in practically every service-related research literature out there, is in the marketing discipline, they actually differentiated products and services. And when I first read this, it was totally like one of those big, no kidding, but I wish I would have come up with it. They really delineated that services are intangible. We absolutely know that. Hence, it's a little bit harder to measure, harder to manage to a certain degree. Perishability. Usually that example is attributed to airlines. The plane takes off, the seats aren't filled. Basically, you can never recover that inventory. Same as a restaurant. Empty seats equals inventory that can never really be necessarily reused or recovered. The key piece here, and this is translating more into the modern day research, intangibility it spanned pretty much 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s. Now we're getting into simultaneity and inseparability. Those are actually kind of my favorite piece, because simultaneity really speaks to, and these are all just really conceptual frameworks. And when I first read these, it made me really think of service in a different way. So that's really the key piece, is thinking of it in a different way. That our service staff are actually creating, delivering, and the customer is consuming this dynamic all at the same time. Inseparability speaks to the customer is actually co-creating this service with us. So it's a new way to think of service. Most people don't think of it in that way. So I like to really point that out, and again, it transfers through most all service research you'll find. Heterogeneity, obviously, it's highly customizable. We can't necessarily create 100%, replicate the same service experience every time. We have different customers, different dynamics. Moving into the 90s, service transferred more into customer satisfaction. We found out service quality. They actually still transferred into this service quality. They defined, some authors came up with a ServQual, which is a model, which is a gap model analysis. Service, again, is very hard to package and put into boxes neatly and cleanly. So we have models that they're starting to define and look at how can we identify the gaps in service where we may have potential issues. A lot of this work was coming out of HR management and organizational psychology. It started shifting a little bit. Marketing was still prevalent with all research. Fun pieces of all the linkage moving forward. Found that basically is determined that there's a direct linkage and correlation of overall customer satisfaction to overall customer loyalty, which also stems from service quality. Again, seems like a no-brainer. It's like, yeah, okay, we see that. But it's also been proven too that once you have the linkage of all that, high service quality, customer satisfaction is high, loyalty is high, it does improve revenue and profits. So now we're getting a little somewhere with all of this different separate research linking back together. And I'm going to come back to some of the organizational psychology components, because I think it's very important. So I heard a lot today about it's the people. It's the people creating a service or actually delivering the service that's really important. Moving into the 2000s, it's all about culture. And we still are now. I can hardly open a business, any articles or any kind of zines that don't mention organizational culture. And there's a whole plethora of different ways of calling it that. Unfortunately, most of them, once you read them, really are referring to climate versus culture. But again, it's a terminology. Organizational culture is its own whole study area. The interesting piece is there's two major camps that actually study organizational culture. One is that they believe organizations are culture, and they refer to that as organization is a culture of itself. And then the other camp is organizations have culture. And that's one where most hospitality and business management reside. They believe organizations have culture that is a managerial variable. So there's much debate and discussion about that, far more than for today, but something to think about. So organizational psychology brought forth a lot of different concepts, again, ways to think about service and service delivery that will help you, I think just, again, give you that mental framework and mindset of how you can think about service. Organizational psychology brought forth, they started delving into what are the personal characteristics of service, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What are the key characteristic traits that make up of a good service person? Boundary spanners, and again, most of these terms right here you'll find in most any service research out there. They're weaved in there somehow, some way. They refer to service, and I hate to use the term frontline service because it sounds like you're at war. The customer contact service employee is finally being recognized as ultimately important to the organization. Why? They're boundary spanners. And what that means is I span the boundaries between the internal organization and the external with the customer. Quite often your boundary spanner is the only point of contact that organization has with your customer. And that's our customer contact employees right out front. With that comes the challenge of, and I've heard a lot of this today as well, there are what are determined as in-role and extra-role behaviors. In-role is your job description. The very defined roles that are actually in role with that job description, defined what you're supposed to carry out. Extra role is actually that do everything it takes to make the customer happy. It's vague. It's kind of doesn't really have some boundaries on it. So extra role behaviors without much structure or framework or empowerment into some degree can actually create service role ambiguity. And the unfortunate component with role ambiguity and role conflict creates actual employee dissatisfaction, which translates directly to customer dissatisfaction. And hence that whole chain goes. Because also with that is lowered service quality, lower service customer satisfaction, and so on and so forth, which ultimately affects revenues and profits. And then newer, probably in the last 5 to 10 years, is service-oriented organizational citizenship behaviors, which can be abbreviated. Citizenship behaviors ties to culture. So it's a new way to look at how can we influence service behaviors with employees internally to help mitigate or eliminate some of these other issues that might go on through frustrations or through this ambiguity that might be happening. Human resource management looked into selectivity in hiring practices. It's very common. 3 main key characteristics of good service employees: agreeableness, empathy. Empathy jumps off as really the key number 1, and empathy translates immediately into I can read your body language. If I'm high on empathy, I can read that person's body language. However, you can't have it separate from conscientiousness. I may be able to read your body language, but if I don't do anything with it, it still doesn't matter. But agreeableness, you don't want, obviously, people contesting your customers at the table. So they're agreeable, high in empathy, and high conscientiousness. Which also brings into a lot of other research really delineated hard skills versus soft skills. Hard skills being the actual physical training that we do, all those details at the table, half-inch in, measurements, everything like that. Soft skills, it's the actual person factor. It's back to the personality of the actual employee. Aesthetic skills is a very interesting thing. We don't talk about that in the US. We're too probably PC. But in Europe and the UK in particular, they have no problem talking about aesthetic skills. Do you have the look and the sound and the appearance of that organization? And they talk quite openly about it. We do it here in the US. We just don't really talk about it, which I find fascinating. With that too, under the human resource management framework, organizational structure and empowerment. And empowerment certainly never means a free-for-all. It's not to just unleash everything, but to give that framework and allow the employees to know what that framework is with which they can actually take care of the customers. That, again, you're helping shortchange any ambiguity and role conflict thereof. But you're allowing them a framework, again, how they can actually be empowered to take care of customers. So currently, and actually probably around 2005 and moving into now, we're still seeing large amounts of organizational culture. That's still the buzzword, although there's very little research on that and very little research in hospitality. They'll look at the direct correlation of self-reported data of, yes, we have a strong service culture and it equals high profitability and high revenues, but we don't know how is that happening. Why is that happening? What are the real key pieces and antecedents that are actually creating this strong organizational culture, other than they're just reporting that they have it? So there's a big gap there. Service productivity is actually, it's always been about productivity, but they're taking a different term and a different look at productivity. Starting to look at service productivity with technology. How can you create more lean services? And it's almost like aghast. Lean services, that actually most is contradictory to high quality service if you're reducing services. But technology can actually be implemented to help create a value perception by the customer that it actually increases their perception of service value by implementing technology. A case in point might be adding iPads for wine lists. in the right environment. You may be able to ease up the actual service of a person at the table by someone allowed to play with that iPad and choose their own wines. They may perceive that as a much more enhanced service value versus having to go to a sommelier. So it's little things like that. How can you integrate technology? Service dominant logic was actually coined in 2005 by IBM. That one is a new, they're starting to use the word complex when we talk about service. So I think service is coming into its own of understanding service science. That's another debating discussion now because we are much more entrenched in service management for many years. Now it's starting to look at it as service science because they realize we've pulled in the sciences to help us understand the service dynamic better. So you'll hear two new terms as customer dominant logic and service dominant logic. So that's kind of the future and where we're trending and heading. So where are the major research gaps? Hospitality. It's kind of unfortunate that in hospitality we don't have much academic discussion going on about service. It's out there, it's very little, it's not where it should be at all. And another big primary area is what's really going on at the individual and organizational level. Again, you can take self-reported data and come up with statistics, and everyone loves a good statistic. But what really is going on at that organizational cultural level? So that is a big gap in research currently. So lucky for me, an author actually did a survey of hospitality and business programs and looked at who's teaching service management, and I did add that there. Who's teaching service management as its own discipline, as its own coursework, not threaded through these other courses? Because really, technically now, most hospitality programs, you get service integrated, and I'm not speaking actually like what we do at the CIA, where we actually have live restaurants where students are actually serving. Speaking more from the management framework of, from marketing, human resources, et cetera, as its own curriculum discipline. Of the global hospitality programs, and I'm only going to mention the domestic, Cornell, Penn State, Michigan State, UNLV, and Central Florida. We're the only ones domestically that actually have courses specific to service management. They did miss one, and that's actually the Culinary Institute of America. We implemented 2 years ago, recognizing the dire need for service management instruction to help to prepare our students to be in your shoes, to be better leaders in service and hospitality. So with that, as I stood at that conference and heard that service is so unresearched and underrepresented in hospitality, what I want to ask of you is actually, as practitioners, we need that reciprocal relationship as researchers, as we need the practitioners to work with us so we can actually come up with and collaborate to produce relevant and practical and meaningful information to help move forward for decision making as well as for our educational purposes, because the course we developed was actually born out of research data to actually create the service management course. So we're asking you to help collaborate with us. I'm actually incredibly grateful. I do have a restaurant organization who's going to work with me for my dissertation, and I'm very thrilled that they've actually opened up that access to me to be allowed to do that. Thank you.